Hi, I'm Jesse Dillon. This is Jesse's Office. Today, the conversation is with visionary futurist designer Radha Mistry, talking about projects like prototyping future cities, floating buildings. Does sustainable architecture mean impermanent architecture? We'll talk about preserving culture and history in an increasingly volatile climate, which obviously throws complication into everything. But first, please subscribe to our YouTube channel to watch this and more episodes, or subscribe to Jesse's Office wherever you stream your podcasts. Leave comments and reviews. I try to respond, or I make Priscilla respond.
Yeah, I might respond.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome, Radha. How are you?
I'm great.
Why did I think you were from New Orleans?
Oh, so my dad's side of the family, when he left India, he settled in New Orleans in the 70s.
Right.
And then I went to Tulane, and I lived there for about 6 years.
Right.
My first day of architecture school was Hurricane Katrina. I sometimes wonder if I hadn't experienced that, would I have taken the same path?
Right.
That was what was that? And that was not a beer.
water.
Anybody who's listening, Jesse's not a beer drinker. Just never had a beer in his life.
What time is it? I feel like it's a little too
And it's a little early.
But what did you see with Katrina? Like, was the challenge to try? Was your thinking immediately like, well, how? Because I guess you were working on a lot of the buildings and things.
Well, so it was interesting because a lot of my points of inquiry stemmed from that experience, which was, I wonder if 50 or 100 years ago that the people that had built this city anticipated a 100-year storm like this.
Right.
And anticipated the impact it would have on people. And so I all of a sudden realized, oh my gosh, I'm not just designing these things from figments of my imagination.
Right. They
really impact people's lives, first of all, and they very much impact, the kind of like fabric of the city and people's futures.
Did you, when you were rebuilding, were you picking through the ruins of the of the thing, and what were your observations? Just what did you see as you were walking through this ghost town?
Yeah, I mean, so first,
was it a ghost town?
It was a ghost town. I mean, New Orleans is one of those cities that I probably know the best, and I grew up in LA County, but I still know New Orleans better than LA, which is horrible. But it's because when they first opened the city up again, and when we were allowed to kind of get back in, most of the street signs were down, most of the stoplights weren't running. So you really had to kind of get a lay of the land just by building a visual map in your head. And I remember flying into the airport for the first time, and it was just pitch black because none of the street lights were really working at the time.
Right.
And so you kind of come into this place, and I had friends who were in California and in New York and in the UK who were kind of texting me and asking, are you kayaking to school? Kind of jokingly.
Right.
And I was like, one, it's pretty rough out here.
Yeah.
Two, a lot of the signs of Hurricane Katrina were still very, very prevalent.
Right.
And you just water level markings on buildings and walls, a lot of the work that I was doing was to kind of go into these cities in the neighborhoods that had been really deeply impacted and basically gut those houses down to their studs.
Yeah.
You saw refrigerators, lined out on the streets because nobody could, because you couldn't even save them.
Right.
And everyone had kind of what we called the Katrina cough because there was so much mold in the air.
Right.
But I think for those of us who were we're coming back here, we're choosing to be here, this is our home, it really helped to kind of solidify and kind of create the sense of community around the fact that we wanted New Orleans to prosper.
Trying to rebuild the city, did that get you thinking about the future of all cities?
Absolutely. And especially because we have such a tumultuous relationship with water, right? And this idea that it's something we can't control, but we're so dependent on it.
Right.
It's something we have to understand how to live around. But, if you don't understand what it's going to do. And in this, like right now we have sea levels that are rising, right? And then on the other hand, there are places where it's getting so hot and there's such a lack of water that we actually have the first refugees of climate change. And so, when we were constructing, we were thinking about, okay, if a storm like this happens again, how high will the water level come? And is the response just raise the building up 6 feet or 3 feet, and that's fine? Or is the response, let's rethink the way we're structuring our systems? Could a building float? Right? Like could your house actually save your life and help you kind of like float away?
So, first of all, you I think one of your titles is a futurist.
It has been, yes.
It has been. But what does that actually mean? Because now what we're really talking about is something else. But how would you define that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always a little bit, what is it? I'm always a little apprehensive about using the title futurist. And I say that because I think it implies that I can predict the future in some sense.
Can you?
No, unfortunately.
Really?
I wish I had a crystal ball. It would make my life so much easier. No, and a lot of, so there's this practice of kind of like future studies and foresight, and all of that really focuses on this idea of let's be more intentional about the way in which we're thinking and planning for the future, right?
Yeah.
And so really what I say that I do is I help people think about what questions should we be asking ourselves, and how might we prototype kind of possible futures.
Right.
So when you look at a city like Detroit, which functioned very well for a long time, and then eventually everybody, for whatever reason, moved out of the center. Like, is it, because I mean, that's a people.
Wait, wasn't it the auto industry collapse and then there was white
I think
flight?
it was more.
It's really
I think it was more complicated. than that.
It was a
Many
very
reasons.
complex issue from what I've read and heard and seen.
But how do you look at that? Have you been there?
Yes.
And when you drive through these, 18 square miles of devastation because there's nobody there, what does it make you think about the future?
I mean, I think it makes me think that we had a lot of blind spots, right? And I think one of the things we try to do in future studies and kind of considering a possible or a preferable future is to consider things across what we call the STEEP framework. So what are the social, technological, economic, environmental, and political forces of change and implications that come from that, right? When we only focus on one or we only amplify one or the other, that's where you start to have blind spots in other areas. So like if we're only working on, driving forward a technologically advanced society, are we considering the social, environmental, political, economic ramifications of that? And are we considering, these drivers of change from a political realm or an economic realm that might impact the technological advancement we're seeking? And I think that's one of the things from, with Detroit, I don't know the full complexity of that problem, but of that city and kind of what the citizens of that city have had to endure. But I think because that economy was so heavily based in automotive, and because our economies are becoming globally linked, and because there's such, kind of like an economic instability in a sense, you could say, there were a lot of blind spots.
Like a city like Rome is still functioning after, 2,000 years.
Yeah.
And what do you think the difference is between, I mean, we're a young country, but, why is Rome functioning? And
That's
yet,
a good question.
Love that you asked this question. And I say that because I just came across like one of my old sketchbooks from maybe 10 or 15 years ago. And in it, I had gone on this massive rant about, why am I learning architecture in the US? Our history is so young, and I want to go to Rome and learn from a country where I want to understand what everlasting means.
It is a good question. And don't forget the pyramids while we're...
and Egypt and, all of these places, right? But
is everlasting a term that you think about things, or is it, because that's such an interesting word?
Yeah. I mean, I think if you had asked me this 10 years ago, I would have said yes. I think now I feel like we have these time horizons that feel so urgent.
Yes.
Like, 2030, 2050, right? And so I think everlasting is a luxury.
Yeah.
right? And I feel like I'm a lot more driven to focus on the 10, 15, 20 year horizon.
Right.
But I have a question about that because you were earlier saying, okay, let's think about a house that could, that could be a boat.
Yeah.
It could float.
Yeah. I mean, I think ideas like that are reactive, right? What that doesn't say is how can we be creating materials that help to clean up our environment or help to remedy our ozone layer or, like help to cool down the earth. So I think there is, I think in the way in which we start to think about the way we build, the way we design for people, we have to be a lot more kind of integrative and circular in our thinking. And a lot of what we think about is how can we design things that will help people thrive and survive, but then what happens to the afterlife of those materials and those buildings, right? And like, how can we ensure that we're not depleting resources and we're not kind of just thinking about a building standing for 100 years, kind of going back to that idea of everlasting, like everlasting doesn't exist, right? We have this notion of like designed obsolescence, and I think that's making its way into architecture as well. We oftentimes put things up to take them down, essentially. And so in doing that, how can we ensure that we're not destroying the planet?
This city that we're in now, maybe one of the youngest cities in the U.S. in a way. It seems to me that most of the building that is constructed here, most of the buildings are sort of meant to last as long as the loans last, and then they need to be torn down. Is that we were in Glasgow, and it's like the buildings are 700 years old. They're made of stone, and you can change the doorway, but you can't change much else. Is that a short-sightedness on what we're doing here in Los Angeles?
I think it depends on kind of how you look at it. I feel like the world is changing. It's changing a lot. It's changing very rapidly. People's needs are changing. So I don't, in this day and age, I don't know if, and I will say, I think there's a place for historic preservation. I absolutely believe that we need to be thinking about, preserving our history and our stories so we understand where we come from. But in 50 years or 100 years, are the buildings that we have right now, are they going to meet the needs of people living there, right? Like I look at the building I live in, up in the Bay and in San Francisco, and it's a 100-year-old building. It has no air conditioning, right?
Right.
My house here.
Yeah,
too.
exactly.
100 years
And
old.
it's a beautiful building, like big bay windows. I love all the daylight I get, but it's hot.
Yeah.
And you don't, and there isn't, there aren't the mechanisms to make that the most kind of preferable place to live.
That's an interesting, because that raises the question, you say historical preservation, super important, and you think about anything that's at risk. When I think of the potential destruction to classic temples or art or anything that tells us, but yet at the same time, if we don't have things that are going to take us into the future, what should we do? We take a wrecking ball to all that stuff, or do we, what do we do? I mean, do we just keep the really old artifacts, and then the stuff like you're just saying, Jesse, things that are in our contemporary purview, we tear them down and rethink? I don't know what, and how do you think about that?
So I think that our attitudes towards policy development need to change because, and I'll just park that for a second, but I'll say that Japan as a country is one of the few countries in the world that is able to maintain this reverence for their history and their tradition and also embrace the contemporary aesthetic. And I've seen that in places like Tokyo and Kyoto and places like that, right? Where you have like these 100-year-old temples right next to the most beautiful concrete I've ever seen in my entire life, like a Tadao Ando building. What I will say is I feel like oftentimes the codes, the policy that we have in place don't really lend themselves to us thinking about the future and thinking about change. And so I feel like if we can start to rethink the way in which we address how we change policy to allow us to design and make things that actually address our needs and expectations.
How important are zoning laws? Because it seems like to, build the density of a city, to put the subway near low-income housing.
Yeah.
Like, how important is, and that's one thing that we actually have control over is the zoning laws that sort of seems like they would adjust the incentives correctly.
Yeah. And I mean, and that in itself is like, I feel like quite a contentious topic as well, right? Because in trying to make room for a growing population, you are displacing people who have been there forever and ever and ever. And, I remember when I was living in New Orleans and there was a freeway overpass that ended up being cut through a neighborhood and taking away a very prominent kind of like community center, that the entire community had rallied around. It was one of the only like grocery stores in the area in a predominant kind of food desert. I think I feel like zoning laws do need to change, but again, we need to be thinking about who is actually going to be in the future.
I just want to play you this clip. I don't know if you can see this, but it's a this is predictions in 1900,
yes,
right?
I love these.
So
Wait, let's see this. Make it let full screen. You know how to do that. That's
and I'm just playing you a little clip, but it's like all of them are wrong.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Let's see. I want to see.
These paintings, by French artist Jean-Marc Coté, depict what people in the early 1900s thought the year 2000 was going to look like.
They're quite funny, these pictures.
So are we saying
But
our
they're not
brains
so.
aren't
But they're
big
not
enough
so
to-
far off.
Apparently, they
Like,
thought everyone would have giant bat wings, as well as
Right.
hang out in the ocean. Like,
These are people underneath the under
But
the
other
water.
people are scuba diving.
how is that guy even driving the whale?
Yeah.
I have seen those illustrations before, but I would argue like they're not really that far off because what are they really talking about here? They're talking about automation.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? And then the other piece, like there was that one image where they're I've seen this one too. I love that interview.
Well, in the year 2000, I think I'll probably be the spaceship to the moon dictating to robots. Or else I may be, I don't know, in charge of a robot court, judging some robots. Or I may be at a funeral of a computer.
A funeral for a computer.
Yeah.
He's not wrong.
I love that.
back from hunting in the cave.
I don't like the idea of sort of getting out and finding you've got a cabbage pill to eat for breakfast or something.
Well, I think all these atomic bombs will be dropping around the place. And one will get near the center because it will sort of make a huge, great big crater.
Well, these are views, they're not so far off, but it does bring up the point that it's hard to see the future.
It
It's
is.
hard to design for the future
Yeah.
because you have, we can, because, you worked on that building, right now where you put sensors everywhere.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's a few different projects where we're kind of looking at this, but for our own office space in Toronto, we used a tool called generative design.
Okay, and people I don't think even know where you work.
Let's back
Right.
up.
Yeah. Let's
So
back up a little bit. Right.
where
So
do you work?
I work for a company called Autodesk.
We love Autodesk.
Sure.
It's very fun. I sometimes feel like I'm going into like Willy Wonka's factory every day. Living
Sure.
out my wildest dreams. But I work for a company called Autodesk. I sit in Autodesk research, and I am. And I drive a lot of our strategic foresight thinking.
And Autodesk is is the main company for the tools that we use to design things in the world, all sorts of tools.
Yeah.
So would you just describe a little bit of that?
Sure. So we work across three main industries: the architecture, engineering, construction, manufacturing, and then media and entertainment. So a lot of the tools that you see, like AutoCAD, was kind of our first real tool that we bought, created. Revit, a lot of the renderers that you see in film and entertainment. A lot of like Autodesk Fusion, basically anything that you might use to design another world, to design a product, to design and build a building or a car. Our tools tend to be in a lot of those processes.
So, you recently undertook to design your own headquarters and you put sensors everywhere.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
why did you do that, and what do you think that brings to it?
Yeah. So just to take a step back, so when we first started to think about the design of that space, we wanted to kind of test our tools out on ourselves. And so we said, how can, so for those of for those who aren't familiar with generative design, what it allows us to do is to kind of input the constraints of a building or a product or, so I can say, I want a chair and I want the chair to be able to withstand 200 pounds and have 4, legs on the ground and a back. That's all I tell it. It will come away and help you kind of explore the entire solution set. So it might say, do you want a chair that looks tall and skinny? Do you want a chair that looks, more plush? Like all of these different configurations. So we said, okay, we've kind of looked at that in the space of products and cars and seat brackets and things like that. What happens if we add more complexity and we think about a building? And what happens if, we're not just considering the physical attributes of the space, things like daylight and structural, integrity and things like that. But what if we input the needs and functions of the human beings inhabiting that space? So we started to map out, where do people walk for meetings? Like, what are their footpaths? Who is okay with a little bit of noise pollution and who isn't? Who prefers daylight and who doesn't? And so we pulled all of these things, including the potential floor plans and all of that programmatic elements, into this tool, and it came away with about 10,000 configurations.
Oh, God.
Right. And so then, so clearly we're not at a place where a machine is going to take your job. Because
So how did you narrow that down?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so then we have a studio in New York called The Living, and they spearheaded this project. And so they then kind of brought it down to, the 3 that we ended up focusing on and the 1 that we ended up building. So what we walked away with from that was this digital model of what the building was, right? And so the where the sensors come in is, this is not the only office space we're going to design and build, right? There's going to be more that come after this. Our customers should be able to kind of learn from this data and to leverage those into insights for themselves. So what if we put sensors into the building that allowed us to really understand, did the thing we designed actually meet the needs of people in that space? So basically the sensors are feeding information into what we call a digital twin. And that digital twin is a digital model of the actual building. And what that means is, the next time we design an office, we have all of this information about how the building actually performed, and it will better help us to inform the next iteration of an office building.
So it's taking all the data in a virtual other building, building B.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then is it also in real time or even in slow time, kind of transforming? So is the shape, is the design also adjusting to the sensor, or is it just the data?
Right now it's just data. And I think that's because, I think in our minds, we feel like data is a very streamlined thing, but in reality, data is so messy.
Yeah.
And we always talk about translating data to insights, right? Like, data doesn't mean anything unless you can actually translate it into
So
something
how
that
do
means
you
something.
translate that into a hypothesis that makes you able to change the next building?
Yeah. So, I mean, and this goes back to, pulling in kind of generative design again, right? Where we're like, okay, this hallway ended up becoming a meeting space because we made it 8 feet wide, right? Do we want that to happen next time?
Right.
Do we want, so do we make another hallway that's 8 feet, or do we say, no, actually traffic ended up moving faster when we had a 32-inch hallway?
Everybody hung out everybody hung out in the halls.
Exactly.
So are you tracking productivity is one question. The second one is, how many people work in the building?
Yeah.
How do you define productivity?
Right. Exactly.
So metrics like that, so there's, data is a very hairy topic, right? Because you start to get into privacy.
Yeah.
And so we're not mapping productivity, because how do you measure success in that sense,
Yes.
right? Like, what are the metrics that you put on someone? Like, I work really well between 8 p.m. and 5 a.m.
Right.
Whoa. I would never see
I'm a
you.
night owl, right? And so for me, the 9 to 5 doesn't really lend itself to my most productive hours.
We're glad we got you here early.
Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised you're even up. Like,
I know. I
talking.
mean, I've got my coffee.
Yeah.
But
Do you need more coffee?
no, I'm okay. Thank you. But and so we don't want to really get into those things where we're starting to kind of where it's like Big Brother kind of,
sure.
looking at human beings and their productivity and trying to turn us into robots. What we want to see is how can we ensure that the things we can design and we do have control over, like our built environment, how can we make those better to make sure people are kind of happier in those spaces?
When you see society changing, as it's changing now, and there's a lot of things that you can't really predict. It's like we have the future of work. We have we don't own our car. We drive Uber. We maybe own a piece of a room. We don't own the whole house anymore. Like, how do you as a futurist think about what societies, if we want to design for the future right now, it seems like a pretty precarious spot, to understand what might be out there.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, so the funny thing is, I feel like people have felt like this always. Right. And I will say, kind of referring back to, what you were saying about like Lyft and Uber and all these companies, like we are moving from these models of, ownership of products to usership of services. But I also believe that that's because it's allowing people to kind of move around more freely. Right. We're not necessarily tethered to our technology in the same way that we were. But if you look back at some of the kind of speculative design, paper architecture things from the 50s and 60s and 70s, like the Metabolists, like Archigram, Super Studio, Ant Farm, they were grappling with some of the same things. There was a lot of uncertainty coming out of the post-war era, right? And people didn't really know, like, what's the economy going to look like? Where's technology going to go? We were still thinking about, as you can see in that clip that you showed me, we were still grappling with the idea of robots taking over our jobs and, artificial, in so many words, artificial intelligence kind of being a part of our daily lives,
right.
and these food pills and things like that, very like the Jetsons kind of way of thinking. So I feel like I don't feel like I'm starting with a blank slate.
Right.
Right. I think a lot of thinking about the future does require looking to the past.
The Russian Olympics, the Sochi, was it Sochi? Is that the name of the city?
Yeah.
Total disaster.
Yeah.
The buildings weren't ready. They didn't even get finished by the time they happened. And then now it's a ghost town, and you have all this and this is the story of a lot of Olympics around the world. So how do we, we've sort of dealt with that here in Los Angeles before, where the places got reused, but how important is it to think about the reuse of these big buildings?
So important. And I know that, like, I remember I was living in London when the 2012 Olympics was, we were kind of gearing up for that. And I remember, with the Olympic Park in Stratford, they were thinking about, reusing the athletes' village for housing, for like low income housing and stuff. And I think the intentions were great. It ended up kind of falling flat a little bit because of maintenance costs. But, we're actually exploring this at Autodesk right now.
Wait, what?
This idea of like what happens with Olympic cities, because it's a really good case study to think about a city in a very compressed time frame, right? So you almost get to see the dynamics of like how people move and how cities emerge in a way that you wouldn't get to if you had to wait for a city to really develop over 15 or 20 or 50 years, right?
Yeah.
And so with the LA Olympics coming up, we've kind of taken that as an opportunity to say, like, what if, and this was more of a speculative kind of endeavor, but, what if we build something to know that we're going to take it down, right? And so we are putting together this, an athletes' village complex with the connection details, with the materials to make it easy for disassembly as well. And then kind of thinking about where might those materials then be used and where might they go? So instead of thinking about a construction site as like one site in its own little echo chamber, what if we started to think about, a dynamic kind of construction ecosystem, right?
In other words, these sites could be built, because the Olympic Village site, it's like they probably don't last very long. It's like you're never going to have that purpose again at that place. Can you disassemble it and put it out in the city somewhere else?
Why couldn't the Olympics committee lease out materials.
Right.
Right.
But this is the antithesis of the building in Rome
yes.
that has withstood the test of time to an idea of a flexible architecture, which we were discussing with Hitachi Obi the other day.
Yeah.
Regarding the same idea, like what is the future? In the future thinking, do we have to contemplate a different idea because the climate environment is rapidly upon us? And so is it a different idea? Is something sustainable mean that it can go up and go down as opposed to it's going to be everlasting?
Yeah.
And what is so does that raise all those questions?
I mean, I think if you consider, Greek and Roman architecture, a lot of that was about demonstrating power. Right.
Yeah.
We don't do that anymore in that sense. Like we don't use our buildings to demonstrate our wealth. And so I feel like a lot of, what we have to be thinking about now is, and to be frank, like I don't think that's sustainable.
Yeah.
Right. Like putting a building that's going to be standing there for 100 or 200 years. What happens if in 50 years it becomes inhabitable?
Yeah. Right.
And then it's still just standing there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I do think we need to be rethinking what we mean by what is good, right? And like what is good architecture, what is good design, what is sustainable. And a lot of what we're considering now is considering resource constraints and the fact that needs and expectations change so rapidly now. Sustainable and good might be that, we design something to take it down and we do it in a way that has the least amount of negative impact on the planet.
I think a place where you see that is refugee camps, which are really cities.
Yes.
Yeah.
But and they're there for 20 or 30 years. Maybe they grow into a city, or maybe they don't. I mean, how do you figure that into your thinking?
Yeah. So we're working on a project right now with the UNHCR for some refugee camps, and a lot of what we're thinking about is, oftentimes these refugee camps kind of emerge in a very urgent manner, out of necessity to house a lot of people from a humanitarian crisis or a natural disaster, and nobody's really planning out the mechanisms and the infrastructure to make sure that they're actually, that the people there are actually like getting what they need. And what ends up happening then is the conditions aren't always as livable, right? And so I think what we can do with our tools is to start thinking about, these are cities. People have sometimes been in these camps for 7 to 10 years. And I have personal friends who have had to deal with those conditions. And so, let's stop thinking about this as these temporary makeshift structures and really start thinking about, our definitions around what is a city, what is long-term or short-term. And I feel like the tools and technology that we're starting to have are starting to allow that a little bit more, because we can say, let's use materials that allow us to break this down really quickly, but also allow us to put this up very quickly.
You have things now, the Elgin marbles, the pieces of Greece that were taken to Rome and Paris and these different places.
Yeah.
You could, and obviously those things are going to go back, whether people want them to go back or not. Eventually they're going to go back. But with virtual reality and with a lot of the ways that technology are going now, can you have a piece of Rome in the same city, next to a piece of, Paris, next to a piece of, when we see a giant statue torn down by the Taliban, can we have it returned to us in a different way? Does the meaning of a library change as technology changes? Is that a useful tool?
I mean, I have a love-hate relationship with AR and VR, because I feel like I think there's so many wonderful things. Like it can augment our world in a way where we have access to more information and perhaps more ways of, one of my colleagues always talks about using AR and VR as a tool to help people become better versions of themselves, right? So like, could you be wearing a headset that, and even simple things like, don't throw that in the trash, recycle it, right? Like silly, simple things like that. And, if you think about how much, there was an infographic that I had seen, this really beautiful graph, and it was talking about how much knowledge is destroyed due to like conflict and war. And so like the notion that the idea that we could kind of like bring these things back to life, to me is wonderful. It's amazing. Like I would love to see the Taj Mahal in its original glory, you know, like not where all the stones and the inlay have been kind of picked out and stuff like that. And like, what an amazing learning experience that might be. On the flip side, I also wonder, like, if you have a piece of the Eiffel Tower in the U.S., is it still the Eiffel Tower?
Right.
Right? Like, does it still...
Well, we're certainly learning that in China, where we do have pieces of it.
Exactly, right? Or like in the U.S., we have, you know, Las Vegas, which is
Although
a very interesting
that,
specimen.
You know what I mean?
Right. But like, but I do wonder, like, you know, when we start to apply a global, like a global aesthetic, do we lose our kind of local stories?
Yeah.
You know, one problem that we're going to wrestle with in the next 40 or 50 years is depopulation. Because, and you see a hint of that in places like Detroit, even though that's people leaving the center.
Right.
But it hints at, you know, when, like in Japan, population's actually declining.
Right, because of the aging population.
And so I think you probably see that in lots and lots of places. Like, how does that make you think about the future when corporations can no longer grow just forever because they've reached the saturation point and the population starts to decline? Does that affect wealth? And then ultimately, does that affect the way we need to use these cities in a new way?
I mean, I think, and this is why I say, like, I think we need to be rethinking what we mean by permanent, right? Because it's not that people are going to cease to exist. Like, you know, we anticipate there's going to be 10 billion people on the planet by 2050. Where are they going to be, right? So I feel like the locus of control are going to shift to places like Africa and India and places like that. But like, and in, you know, so like, how can we be shifting our materials, shifting our thinking, shifting the way that we're designing and making to support those populations?
You said earlier, you know, we need this change in policy in order to really be thinking, you know, thoughtfully about the future. We have to be thinking about this. How do we create like a field where people are, you know, bringing this skill set that you have now to these big problems? I mean, is there like a coalition of futurists and you all come together? I mean, like how do we get the thinking quick, you know, into big problem solving?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I feel like, you know, there have always been, at least for the last like 50 or 60 years, there have been these like strategic foresight teams. You'd find them in corporate strategy. You'd find them, you know, like Shell famously kind of came up with the 2x2 matrices and was thinking about the future kind of for their own economic gain. But, you know, you get, and then there was a lot that came up through academia. But I think only recently has it become so top of mind for so many people. So there are things like the Association of Professional Futurists, which I'm part of, and there are different conferences that happen all around, like these niche conferences. It's starting to become a little bit more mainstream. You know, the World Economics Forum is really thinking about, you know, not just in kind of driving new policies, but rethinking the way in which policy development itself happens. Because, you know, the way that we're developing technology is completely shifting. And so what ends up happening is you have this very steep curve, like a steep slope that goes, you know, of technological advancement. And then you have a very, very slow line below that of policy development and adoption. Exactly. And that gap in the middle is this massive blind spot, and it's a massive unmet need.
When you go to those conferences, or what are on top of mind? Like what are the topics that are trending?
A lot of what I'm seeing is, of course, like robots and automation. What is our relationship between humans and machines? And then a lot of futures around a non-Western ideology. So thinking about the fact that populations are going to shift, and, you know, recognizing that a lot of the way we think and talk about the future kind of came out of Europe and North America. How can we ensure that the stories that we're telling and the way in which we're designing and making for the future is actually engaging and addressing the needs of populations in, you know, larger areas like India and the continent of Africa?
It used to be that the future was a hopeful thing.
Yes.
Now the future. Now, of course, Jesse's going to get mad at me because I always go to the dark place.
Well,
but
let's watch this.
A little dystopic.
Yeah.
This is
Blade Runner.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is the trailer for Blade Runner.
Yeah.
But it's such a dark
Well, it
dystopian.
was dark before Blade Runner, wasn't
I
it?
understand, but
Every civilization was built off the back of a disposable workforce. But I can only make so many. Happy birthday.
Oof. We can't use this. We don't have the rights
doesn't matter. You don't need it.
To things.
It's a trailer.
That's what we do here.
It's
We keep order.
So, yeah, it's dark.
This is the dark dystopian future. Do you think that the future is like this? Like, how do you envision it?
It is so easy to go to the dystopian, right? And oftentimes when I talk to people, even inside of my company, I say, like, I'm going to challenge you to think about what's positive. Now, I think my job is to make sure that we don't get too Pollyanna-ish kind of in our thinking with those rose-colored glasses, because I think oftentimes we can become very, like the promise of technology, right, is so shiny. But I have this thing called, like, I call it grumpy futures. It's like, why did we decide that the future is going to be stark and white and plastic and shiny and, like, not human in any sense of the way that we conceptualize it? I think, I maybe naively believe that we do have control over the future in some way. And, give me another 50 years, maybe that will change. But, so I feel like the vision you put out there and the vision you work towards is what you will ultimately kind of come away with. And yes, there are going to be things that we don't foresee, right? There might be complete economic collapse. There might be, San Francisco and Los Angeles might go underwater, or an earthquake might come and kind of shift us away and make us an island, whatever it is. But the factors that we have control over, like, why not drive those towards something better?
If one of the projects we work on is for the Precision Medicine Initiative for the U.S. government, and one of the challenges is to invite lots of different groups, African Americans, Latinos, American Indians. They may all have real reasons about why they don't want to participate. But when we talk about the future, how do we make sure that everybody's included in?
Yeah, I mean, and that goes back to the, what I keep saying, which is, like, we have to be so conscious of the language that we use when we talk about the future, because that in itself is quite alienating.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And we have to really rethink the tools that we leverage to design the future. And we see this a lot even in, like, artificial intelligence and even tools like generative design, right? We are very conscious of the fact that we are coding in design algorithms, right? I think you make a more inclusive future by including people in it.
It's bringing that up is so critical when you do think about the future, because there are populations, in certain communities and urban cities around America where there is no future, where the future for a 10-year-old kid, a young boy of color will be, well, maybe I'll get to 17, 18, we're going to prison. And that's the reality of what might be in the mind of the future.
Absolutely.
So how does the future belong to everyone?
And this and this is why I say, when we think about the future, we have to think about who, preferable for who. There's this framework that we use where it's kind of like there are all of the possible futures, there are probable, plausible, and then preferable. And oftentimes we get so caught up in preparing ourselves for the probable futures and getting really wrapped up in the plausible that we don't ask ourselves, who is this preferable for? And a lot of the work is to take these stories about the future and our thinking about the future outside of our glass towers and our, white walls, and kind of go into these communities, and not from this mindset of, here, let me come and help you, but to say, like, let me listen and learn.
Yes.
What
do you need?
Yeah.
Yes.
Let me
absolutely.
listen and learn. And that's, like, my biggest job. I always say that. I was like, if I am, this feels a little bit odd for me because oftentimes I spend most of my time listening and very little time talking.
Right.
Because I don't know anything, right? And all my job is to connect the dots.
We have a desire, well, some of us do, to live in a more pluralistic society. So more empowerment for women, for minorities, for people, for people with disability rights, like just all the people who are held out to be more in the center. As a designer, do you have to take that into account of what the future might be and how that might change things?
All the time. And I mean, that's almost like a personal thing for me. As a child of immigrants, as a woman of color, as as someone who is oftentimes a lot younger than most of the people in the room, I think it's so important to make space and consider space for all of these other factors, because if you don't, we don't design for those things. And there was an interesting book that had been published back in 1968, and it was called Towards the Year 2018, and it was considering a 50-year future. And what they had done to come up with that book was they gathered about 50 of the world-renowned futurists of that time in a room for about 3 days and said, like, think about all across social, tech, economic, environmental, political. But if you look at that list of people, and no offense to you,
It's all
Jesse,
white men?
I was going to
Oh,
say,
it was all white guys my age?
It was all, it was all like middle-aged white men. And so it's like, and I encounter this all the time where it's like, they have the best of intentions, but you only know what you know.
Of course.
Right.
Yeah.
And so like, if we don't make the space to bring in folks, people of color, women, folks from different socioeconomic standings, to bring those people into the room, to give them a seat at the table, who are we really designing for?
One last question. Is there any project, like what are you really excited about? I mean, right now that you can talk about, because we don't want to get, we want to
So
sign
many
your
things
NDA.
I wish I could talk about. No, I mean, I think like the thing that I'm very, this last thing really touched on what I'm most passionate about, which is how do we make sure that we're making space for all of the people, right? For what the world is really going to look like in 2050. And so I am kind of obsessed with ensuring that the language that we use, the tools that we develop, the way in which we consider and explore the future, includes all sorts of human beings with all sorts of needs and expectations from all walks of life, and makes them feel like they are engaged and have ownership and agency over this future.
In spite of political, if you measure social progress in decades, this is a pretty sucky decade right now. But I think we would say that, we're on the road to progress, and maybe we can't see exactly what it might be, but we're definitely getting, going in the right direction. Do you feel that?
I do. I mean, I definitely have days where I come home and I'm just like, God, there's just too much future. Like I can't think about it. I can't look at it. It's too overwhelming. But I do, because I feel like at least even, in some of the younger generations, there is so much hope. And now with, things like the internet and stuff, people are so much more connected. And yes, there are some bad things that have come with that as well. But I feel like it's given younger people a lot more of a sense of agency as well. And I feel like, we want better for ourselves. And so you're no longer just growing up, in a suburb of downtown LA. You probably have friends all around the world. So you understand at a very young age what somebody in India might be like, or what somebody in the UK might be like, or someone in, Ecuador, whatever it is. And I feel like that sense of awareness of what's happening in the world is hopefully going to give us a be future.
Great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Very much. It was wonderful. Appreciate it.
Thank
lot
you.
to think about.
Thanks for watching and listening. Don't forget to subscribe and click here for the next episode.